One of my favorite etymologies of the word thank relates it to the word to think. And I want to thank the participants in the workshop leading up to this and all the participants in the conference, as well as the large audience for the opportunity to think with you. And I'm looking forward to this. So, turning the fearful sphere, prepositional tactics in and for the global. Ishai Yudisman's oil and egg tempera painting on wood, number 8 from the series The Economist Shuffle, 2006, reposes the question of the terrain of global practice, turning up the temperature reading of global warming and peeling off the cool blue surface of the Earth's aquatic bandage to expose an uncontainable and uninhabitable molten core. Thinking with such disorienting and reorienting visions of the fractured global in terms of spatiality, temporality, and movement, this conference not only asks again just what is the work of art history, its objects, theorizations, praxis, including political praxis, and methods of analysis, in an age so often characterized as transnational or global, and in a moment marked by profound precarity and shaken by economic, social, and environmental crises, focused in part on heated contestatory zones of commerce and assembly, Occupy Wall Street, Tahrir Square, and the warming of the globe. But the conference and our conversation here turns as well on the agonistic questions of biopolitics and the forms of life and death. If the global is neither unitary nor a given, nor even a static thing, if the world is, as Jean-Luc Nancy formulates it in The Creation of the World, praxis, becoming world and taking place, what tactics might we prompt to emerge in the wake of the global turn? Or in other words, what might the work of an exploded art history or visual studies without borders become? Tactics, as Michel de Certeau would describe, are those practices without proper place, that take advantage of fleeting moments in time and insinuate themselves fragmentarily and without taking over. Via the untranslated and yet navigated cross-currents of words in Amitav Ghosh's novel Sea of Poppies, Aruna emphasized the ways in which the frictions of negotiating radical differences of language in the dynamics of encounter, including the misrecognition of the parts of speech, is it adjective, noun, or verb, may offer their own productivities, among them the inventive deformation of languages in parts. I'd like to push this plea for the promise of part languages and languages in parts by returning to and concluding with the proposition of a set of 5 tactics, premised on that part of speech, the preposition, with the pre rather than the pro, that does the work of encounter. Prepositions that place and displace bodies, things, events, and concepts in dynamic and altering contacts of relation. The suggested tactics in and for the global is a matter of prepositions. Prepositions that forge relation in and across differences without turning them into the solidities of either sameness or hardened difference. These prepositional tactics might be understood as restating the question of the tactics for the global in terms of fluctuations and movements in the intonations of languages that might yet make all the difference. Intonation, literally a change in tone, is a minor part of the performance of speech that nonetheless shifts what language does as a matter of the changing and even tipping points at which the stress of a rise or lowering in tone may fall in syntax. It also affects the fall of language, in its gravitational pull, if you will, in the space and time of the world. Confronting the ambitions and the folly of the dream of total knowledge, German Jesuit Athanasius Kircher's diagram of the instability of the Earth's position from the 1679 treatise Turris Babel takes the device of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, the passage from Genesis in 6 different languages, Latin, Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, flutter around the pillar of aspiration, to poke phallic fun at the dangerous limits of technological ambition, a reach so absurdly high that tipping point weight of its materialized hubris in attempting to reach heaven, here marked as the moon, knocks the Earth out of its natural place at the fixed center of the cosmos, splintering the tower into a cacophony of languages. In The Fearful Sphere of Pascal from 1951, Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges composes a kind of micro-history of the itinerary of a particular figure. the sphere and the spherical cosmologies it projects from God as an eternal sphere for Xenophanes of Colophon, and the sphere as the most perfect and uniform of figures, one in which each point is equidistant from a common center in Plato's Timaeus, through the Ptolemaic astronomy of the earth as a fixed point at the center of the universe, quote unquote, preserved in Dante's Inferno. But this micro-history of the figure of the sphere is also more profoundly a meditative intervention in the writing of universal history. Indeed, the micro-history, or quote, chapter, as Borges calls it, opens with an evocative prepositional characterization of what that history consists of. Quote, it may be that universal history is the history of a handful of metaphors. And yet Borges' tour of the various turns given the sphere concludes with an even more resonant prepositional of. Quote, it may be that universal history is the history of the different intonations given a handful of metaphors. The very different intonations of the metaphor of the fearful sphere of Pascal, with which Borges titles his microhistory, gives us an image for doing the global that holds in tension the seemingly impossible. The concept of the sphere within and not despite the profound fear of its incompassibility and explosion into a multiplicity of centers. And I quote, in that dispirited century, the 17th, the absolute space which had meant liberation for Bruno became a labyrinth and an abyss for Pascal. He abhorred the universe and would have liked to adore God. But for him, God was less real than the abhorred universe. He deplored the fact that the firmament did not speak and compared our life with that of castaways on a desert island. He felt the incessant weight of the physical world. He experienced vertigo, fright, and solitude, and he put his feelings into these words. Nature is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Thus do the words appear in the Braunschweig text, but which the critical edition published by Turner in Paris in 1941, which reproduces the crossed-out words and variations of the manuscript, reveals that Pascal started to write the word effroyable, a fearful sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. I'd like to suggest that this sphere between the infinite and the fearful, the ever-expansive and fluctuating, and the frightful limitation and even abandonment, this sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, projects a figure of and for the practice of the global in and with a difference in intonation that offers a difference in relation. That is, the fearful sphere offers a vision of the global that does not disavow, but rather reckons by putting us into relation with our fear and fragility of the encompassable, in the sense of fluctuating and expanding, and the exploded without giving up hope in the decentered and multicentered and ultimately unbounded, fractured or shattered, and yet perhaps still sustainable globe. Thus, I shall put 5 propositional tactics in the form of prepositions into play. 1, where it comes from, transcultural genealogies and hybrid origins. First, the prepositional from, and the not at all simple problem of origins and the question, where does it come from? And the in relation established or troubled by the itineraries and implied narratives of its answer. I'd like to suggest that reconsideration of Fernando Ortiz's Cuban counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar, first published in 1941, and specifically its narrative deployment of the term transculturation to posit a transcultural genealogy for modernity, may give us a very different way to intone the from. Cuban counterpoint provides an alternative account of the development of modernity that situates Cuba, or the plantation colony, not as an outpost or passive recipient of technology transfer, but instead as a geographic laboratory for the making of the modern capitalist system out of the slave plantation. In a global flow recharacterized as an huracan of white powder and spiraling smoke, Doña Azucar and Señor Tobacco are transformative agents that not only remake Cuba, or the New World, but also storm back across the ocean to fundamentally alter in substance something called European modernity. Whipping between production and consumption, between planting and the colonial sites of manufacture, and from indigenous practices and belief systems and the slave labors of supply into the bottomless wants of the pipes and cups of metropolitan and imperial demand. The wind-up death dance of these commodity actors on the global stage of the colonial plantation machine profoundly questions the claimed scientific rationality and civilizing force of capitalism's commercial traffic. Furthermore, such transformative consumption is not merely a matter of raw materials, as in sugar and tobacco, but rather the origins of Europe's claim to reason, imagination, and refinement. In a tactical reading of various early modern European prints, including the frontispiece to Richard Braithwaite's The Smoking Age, 1617, Ortiz does not merely suggest that contact with the Americas altered the course of European development long before the 20th or 21st century, but rather that the very core of ostensible European difference and identity was constituted out of that contact. Quote, one might say that reason, starved and benumbed by theology to revive and free itself, needed the help of some harmless stimulant. For this, to help sick reason, tobacco came from America. Through a lengthy and carefully plotted sequence, Ortiz's Cuban counterpoint packs indigenous belief and ritual into the sheaves of tobacco sent across the Atlantic, and into the pipes of, for example, the English dandies and roaring men reading the twirling clouds of smoke as an imitation of Cuban ebullition, or the Indian manner of smoking, and the curls of Latin text as a sign of the curls of thought, gestures of the imaginative thinker, performances of elegance and taste, and acts for claims to masculinity that could not have been exercised without the transculturating influence from the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and specifically the Taíno and Siboney of Cuba. Thinking with such turnabout storytelling devices, Ortiz's storm of counterpoint may yet prompt new narrative tactics in which the question, where does it come from, entails complexities in relation that promise to undo and rewrite the neo-imperial priorities and imagined purities in space and time. 2, in the wake of counter-histories and identities in the break. After reading Sigmund Freud's last work, Moses and Monotheism in Mexico, Frida Kahlo painted a response in oil on Masonite to Freud's articulation of the internal limits or breach of Jewish identity, the way in which that identity could never be fully incorporated into one unitary whole. For, according to Freud's counter-archaeology, the founder of Jewish identity, Moses, was an Egyptian. Kahlo wrote of her landscape version of history in which the ostensible great male protagonists of Old and New World historical cosmologies are pushed to the periphery of the molten orb of sunflower sun, part planet, part botanical specimen, that, quote, what I wanted to express most intensely and clearly was the reason that people need to invent or imagine heroes is because of their unmitigated fear of life and fear of death. In this synoptic view of history in the wake of multiple diasporas and the colonization of the New World, two dark hands embrace skeletons that frame three variations on fertilization that compress human embryo, fruit, fetus, and seed pod, putting the viewer not merely in a confrontation with the unfolding of life and death, but even more starkly the spectacular emergence of hybrid forms of life and death, and with them the materialization of internal and irreducible differences in the break that they do not repair. The prepositional phrase, in the wake of, troubles any absolute break between pre- and post-colonial, but does not patch over the traumatic ruptures. Rather, in the wake of begins to chart a tactics of writing history in and with the ruptures and discontinuities of time. In his last book, Freud and the Non-European, 2003, the late Edward Said thinks with the secular wound of irreconcilable difference in Freud's Moses and Monotheism, to begin to imagine the tactics for another kind of history writing that does not override or repress the flaw, and that also offers the possibility of new formations of worlds to come. Quote, history being always that which comes after, Said asks, can so deeply undetermined a history ever be written? Can it aspire to the condition of a politics of diaspora life? Can it ever become the not so precarious foundation in the land of Jews and Palestinians of a binational state in which Israel and Palestine are parts rather than agonists of each other's history and underlying reality? Said answers the affirmations nested in these questions with the hope he finds in the pains taken to elucidate the condition of history and identity formed around irreducible and irremediable fracture and trauma. This is a prepositional or prepositional tactics in and of the wake, of history writing that does not fill in or patch over, but instead practices a kind of painstaking care or mourning without end. Catachresis, displacement toward. Number 3. As Said's hoping toward worlds to become already suggests, this prepositional tactics of in the wake and the mourning without end need not homogenize time or look only with the ever backward glance. Gayatri Spivak has characterized the post-colonial condition as one of catachresis, or the effect of the mixed metaphors produced by the displacements and reconnections of matter and bodies. But we could also argue that the seemingly out of place is also a matter of the out of time, or displacements in time that may yet also call up or unfold different futures. That is, the catachrestic condition of being in the wake of may also demand a tactics that refuses to ask simply what it is, or to what time and place does it belong, but rather puts these questions in necessary transformative relation with what they may yet become, as in Said's own emphasis on the can it ever become. This beaded zemi, now in the Pigorini Museum in Rome, is hailed by the catalog to the Museo del Barrio's 1997 exhibit on pre-Columbian art and culture from the Caribbean as, quote, the finest surviving Taino work of art produced in the decades between the arrival of Columbus in 1492 and the disappearance of the Taino culture in the first half of the 16th century. At once God, ancestral spirit, the shaman who incarnates and mediates those gods, and the sculptural object that may provide a place of dwelling for those spirits, this zemi was acquired for the Cosby family, along with other New World objects, including an Aztec ritual book and sacrificial knives in the 17th century. This zemi is an object in and of encounter, an instance perhaps of what Serge Grzinski has termed the cloud-like and unpredictable forces of mestizo invention. First identified as an African fetish, this zemi has, since the early 1990s, attracted interest for its inventive incorporation of styles and materials that would seem to come from different places. Amerindian grammars of dualism, such as the twinning of life and death. The zemi literally has two faces. And new and old world materials, imported Venetian glass and African rhinoceros horn, and locally acquired Caribbean conch shell discs, cotton, and cold-hammered placer-mined gold. A catachrestic object produced out of the displacements of colonization, Taino trade, and European collecting, the zemi may not just condense the life-death transformation of the living dead shamans of the Taino, who took hallucinogens to raise the fecund possibilities of dead ancestors, but may also cross the time of stylistic influence and the story that would say that the Taino are dead, with the more magical or spiritual time of what such objects promise to materialize and animate. But it takes a further tactics of catachresis to push the mixed metaphors of contact and encounter toward present and future possibilities beyond the either-ors of live or dead natives and live or dead cultures. 4, love in prepositions, affect in relation. These prepositional tactics are insufficient without consideration of the wishes, hopes, and fantasies that animate these tactics of relation and the affects and desires produced in these encounters. Argentinian artist Jorge Maqui's installation, Still Song, for the Experience of Art exhibition curated by Maria de Corral at the 2005 Venice Biennale, suspends a revolving disco ball, and I had to have a disco ball. What's the revolution without being able to dance? So the piece by Maki suspends a revolving disco ball in a room empty except for the exploded shrapnel of mirrored fragments dispersed across the ceiling, walls, and carpeted floor. A 2009 article by Jennifer Allen for Frieze magazine takes the disco ball's revolving and refracting mirrors as a dazzling device of the global that makes the globalized dominance of the society of the spectacle appear natural and inevitable. Quote, looking automatically makes you part of its universe, whether you're standing still or doing the hustle. However, it's precisely from within the spectacle of the exploded that we may find prepositional tactics of possibility, such as the mobilizing currents of affect in relation, developed, for example, in the late Gary Fisher's prose poem, Love in Prepositions, from Gary in Your Pocket, Duke Press, 1996, a posthumous elegy of sorts collected and published with an introduction by the late queer theorist Eve Sedgwick after Fisher's death from AIDS. Enacting its demonstration of the power of prepositions to forge the very relations they might seem merely to describe, Fisher's marvelous meditation on the affective labor prepositions can perform does its work by leaving the bodies, the I's, and the U's unmarked by the usual cuts of difference, the sharp lines of race, gender, sex, nationality. Instead, the I's and the U's are specified only by and in their relation. Quote, I want your prepositions. I want the little U's. I could list them here: in, on, around, under, over, between, near, next to, on top of. Now it's getting too large. The little U's is all I want, probably all I need. I'll list them again for you, but in context, with body, validity, actors and objects of prepositions, and with vigor, at least implied. I want you in me. I want you on me. I want you all around me. Forgive the little flourish there. I want you under me, on occasion anyway, but mainly I want you over top of me, on top of me, to flesh out that second earliest scene still more. I want to remember you as you were in relation to me. While this final turn risks making the other significant only in relation to the self, the you mattering only in relation to the me, there is at the same time something vital in its exercise of the prepositional power of affect in relations that are at once highly specific. This you, this I. Differentiated, the you is not the same as nor becomes the I, and yet also push beyond the identitarian bounds of the socially legislated forms of being and desiring. 5. The potentiality in and from the surround, even just a little. Much has been made of the prepositional possibilities of the geopolitical around, from the circumatlantic to the roots around the Pacific Rim, for the ways in which history, culture, and identity are made and remade in the dynamic movements of contact around the flux of space and time. Nonetheless, I'd like to give this circum at least one more turn. There's another prepositional tactics of the surround that does not describe a pre-existing geography, such as the circumatlantic or Pacific Rim, but rather reckons with what gestures around the injustices, trauma, and damage of the seeming geopolitical givens might yet transform them, that might start to bring that altered, more just world into being. Palestinian artist Rana Bishara's installation Homage to Childhood for the 2009 exhibition Palestine in All Its States at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris fills a room furnished only with a single spare and bare mattress with a profusion of pink balloons, each surrounding a photograph of a displaced Palestinian child in the delicate bubble of a party toy, while overhead a materialized heaven of halos formed by barbed wire and gauze netting threaten to puncture any aspiring balloon that floats to the ceiling. Surround might sound monumental and mighty, like a military strategy of absolute protection and/or complete occupation, the phalanx or battlefield formation that admits neither entry nor retreat. But surround may also gesture toward a tactics in excess of secular modernity, its wars and contestatory politics enacted as the war machine. In the little chapter Halos in the Coming Community, Giorgio Agamben offers a figure and even a practice of potentiality that does not defer the dream of a world more just than this one to the utopia that has no place in the here and now, or to the messianic world that can only come after this one, but rather elaborating on the tactics of the tiny, implicit in the account of an altered world from Walter Benjamin, phrased as a world in which, quote, everything will be as it is now, just a little different. Agamben suggests the possibilities inherent in the contingencies of what is at hand, the traces of what might have been and might yet be otherwise. And this small shift or displacement or alteration in tone and effect is a supplement, but one that already glimmers around the edges of the unstable and fractured form of things as they are. This flicker or glow is a prepositional tactics of the surround. Agamben writes, one can think of the halo as a zone in which possibility and reality, potentiality and actuality become indistinguishable. The being that has reached its end, that has consumed all of its possibilities, thus receives as a gift a supplemental possibility. This imperceptible trembling of the finite that makes its limit indeterminate and allows it to blend, to make itself whatever, is the tiny displacement that everything must accomplish in the messianic world. Its beatitude is that of a potentiality that comes only after the act, of matter that does not remain beneath the form, but surrounds it with a halo. As with other aspects of Agamben's work, particularly the essay Form of Life in Means Without End, Agamben understands form here as non-constrictive and metamorphic, and at the same time inseparable from the questions of the good and even the happy. But beyond the question of the relation between matter, form, and value and the inherent malleability of form, there's also an issue here of scale and the possibility, the notion that even a tiny change might yet have great effects. Finally, this tactics of the surround that initiates the tiny displacement or shift that may yet make all the difference offers a prepositional relation of effort, but with humility, the kind of small work, the micropraxes of listening in and across our differences, but also training and retraining for the coming community. An exploded art history and exploded visual studies without borders in which, rather than asserting property claims over the turf of experts, we continue to learn. Thank you.